Chapter 9 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 9. The Marine Store Dealer. Mr. Lindsey was standing within his own room when Maisie and the strange woman came into the office, and hearing what was said, he called us all three to go in to him, and, like myself, he looked at the woman with a good deal of curiosity, wanting, as I did, to see some likeness to the dead man. But there was no likeness to be seen, for whereas Gilverthwaite was a big and stalwart fellow, this was a small and spare woman, whose rusty black clothes made her look thinner and more meagre than she really was. All the same, when I spoke I knew there was a likeness between them, for her speech was like his, different altogether from ours of the border. "So you believe you're the sister of this man, James Gilverthwaite, ma'am?" began Mr. Lindsey, motioning the visitor to sit down, and beckoning Maisie to stop with us. "What might your name be now?" "I believe this man that's talked about in the newspapers is my brother, sir," answered the woman. "Else I shouldn't have taken the trouble to come all this way. My name's Hanson, Mrs. Hanson. I come from Garston, near Liverpool." "Aye, just so, a Lancashire woman," said Mr. Lindsey, nodding. "Your name would be Gilverthwaite, then, before you were married?" "To be sure, sir, same as James's," she replied. "Him and me was the only two there was. I've brought papers with me that'll prove what I say. I went to a lawyer before ever I came, and he told me to come at once, and bring my marriage lines, and a copy of James's birth certificate, and one or two other things of that sort. There's no doubt that this man we've read about in the newspapers was my brother, and of course I would like to put in my claim to what he's left, if he's left it to nobody else." "Just so," agreed Mr. Lindsey. "Aye, and how long is it since you last saw your brother now?" The woman shook her head, as if this question presented difficulties. "I couldn't rightly say to a year or two. No, not even to a few years," she answered. "And to the best of my belief, sir, it'll be a good 30 years at the least. It was just after I was married to Hanson, and that was when I was about 23, and I was 56 last birthday. James came, once, to see me and Hanson soon after we were settled down, and I've never set eyes on him from that day to this. But I should know him now." "He was buried yesterday," remarked Mr. Lindsey. "It's a pity you didn't telegraph to some of us." "The lawyer I went to, sir, said, 'Go yourself,'" replied Mrs. Hanson. "So I set off first thing this morning." "Let me have a look at those papers," said Mr. Lindsey. He motioned me to his side, and together we looked through 2 or 3 documents which the woman produced. The most important was a certified copy of James Gilverthwaite's birth certificate, which went to prove that this man had been born in Liverpool about 62 years previously. That, as Mr. Lindsey was quick to point out, fitted in with what Gilverthwaite had told my mother and myself about his age. "Well," he said, turning to Mrs. Hanson, "you can answer some questions, no doubt, about your brother, and about matters in relation to him. First of all, do you know if any of your folks hailed from this part?" "Not that I ever heard of, sir," she replied. "No, I'm sure they wouldn't. They were all Lancashire folks, on both sides. I know all about them as far back as my great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers." "Do you know if your brother ever came to Berwick as a lad?" asked Mr. Lindsey, with a glance at me. "He might have done that, sir," said Mrs. Hanson. "He was a great masterful strong lad, and he'd run off to sea by the time he was 10 years old. There'd been no doing aught with him for a couple of years before that. I knew that when he was about 12 or 13 he was on a coasting steamer that used to go in and out of Sunderland and Newcastle, and he might have put in here." "To be sure," said Mr. Lindsey. "But what's more important is to go on to his later history. You say you've never seen him for 30 years or more, but have you never heard of him?" She nodded her head with decision at that question. "Yes," she replied, "I have heard of him, just once. There was a man, a neighbour of ours, came home from Central America, maybe 5 years ago, and he told us he'd seen our James out there, and that he was working as a subcontractor, or something of that sort, on that Panama Canal there was so much talk about in them days." Mr. Lindsey and I looked at each other. Panama! That was the password which James Gilverthwaite had given me. So, here at any rate, was something, however little, that had the makings of a clue in it. "Aye," he said. "Panama now. He was there. And that's the last you ever heard?" "That's the very last we ever heard, sir," she answered, "till of course we saw these pieces in the papers this last day or two." Mr. Lindsey looked round on her with a sharp look. "Do you know aught of that man, John Phillips, whose name's in the papers too?" he asked. "No, sir, nothing," she replied promptly. "Never heard tell of him." "And you've never heard of your brother's having been seen in Liverpool of late?" he went on. "Never heard that he called to see any old friends at all? For we know, as you have seen in the papers, Mrs. Hanson, that he was certainly in Liverpool, and brought clothes and linens there within the last 3 months." "He never came near me, sir," she said, "and I never heard word of his being there from anybody." There was a bit of silence then, and at last the woman put the question which, it was evident, she was anxious to have answered definitely. "Do you think there will be a will, mister?" she asked. "For, if not, the lawyer I went to said what there was would come to me, and I could do with it." "We have seen nothing of any will," answered Mr. Lindsey, "and I should say there is none, and on satisfactory proof of your being next of kin, you'll get all he left. I've no doubt you're his sister, and I'll take the responsibility of going through his effects with you. You'll be stopping in the town a day or two? Maybe your mother, Hugh, can find Mrs. Hanson a lodging?" I answered that my mother would no doubt do what she could to look after Mrs. Hanson, and presently the woman went away with Maisie, leaving her papers with Mr. Lindsey. He turned to me when we were alone. "Some folks would think that was a bit of help to me in solving the mystery, Hugh," said he. "But hang me if I don't think it makes the whole thing more mysterious than ever. And do you know, my lad, where, in my opinion, the very beginning of it may have to be sought for?" "I can't put a word to that, Mr. Lindsey," I answered. "Where, sir?" "Panama!" he exclaimed, with a jerk of his head. "Panama! Just that! It began a long way off. Panama, as far as I see it. And what did begin, and what was going on, the 2 men that knew, and could have told, are dead as doornails, and both buried for that matter. So, in spite of Mrs. Hanson's coming, and her revelations as to some, at any rate, of James Gilverthwaite's history, we were just as wise as ever at the end of the first week after the murder of John Phillips. And it was just the 8th night after my finding of the body that I got into the hands of Abel Crone. Abel Crone was a man that had come to Berwick about 3 years before this, from heaven only knows where, and had set himself up in a business as a marine store dealer in a back street which ran down to the shore of the Tweed. He was a little red-haired, pale-eyed rat of a man, with ferrety eyes and a goatee beard, quiet and peaceable in his ways, and inoffensive enough, but a rare hand at gossiping about the beach and the walls. You might find him at all odd hours, either in these public places, or in the door of his shop, talking away with any idler like himself. And how I came to get into talk with him on that particular night was here. Tom Dunlop, Maisie's young brother, was for keeping tame rabbits just then, and I was helping him to build hutches for the beasts in his father's backyard, and we were wanting some bits of stuff, iron and wire and the like, and knowing I would pick it up for a few pence at Crone's shop, I went round there alone. Before I knew how it came about, Crone was deep into the murder business. They'll not have found much out by this time, yon police fellows, no doubt, Mr. Moneylaws," he said, eyeing me inquisitively in the light of the one naphtha lamp that was spurting and jumping in his untidy shop. "They're a slow, unoriginal lot, the police. There's no imagining in their brains and no ingenuity in their minds. What's wanted in an affair like this is one of those geniuses you read about in the story-books, the men that can trace a murder from the way a man turns out his toes, or by the fashion he's bitten into a bit of bread that he's left on his plate, or the like of that. Something more than by ordinary, you'll understand me to mean, Mr. Moneylaws. Maybe you'll be taking a hand in this game yourself, Mr. Crone?" said I, thinking to joke with him. "You seem to have the right instinct for it, anyway." "Aye, well," he answered, "and I might be doing as well as anybody else, and no worse. You haven't thought of following anything up yourself, Mr. Moneylaws, I suppose?" "Me!" I exclaimed. "What should I be following up, man? I know no more than the mere surface facts of the affair." He gave a sharp glance at his open door when I thus answered him, and the next instant he was close to me in the gloom and looking sharply in my face. "Are you so sure of that now?" he whispered cunningly. "Come now, I'll put a question to yourself, Mr. Moneylaws. What for did you not let on in your evidence that you saw Sir Gilbert Carstairs at yon crossroads just before you found the dead man? Come! You could have knocked me down with a feather, as the saying is, when he said that, and before I could recover from the surprise of it, he had a hand on my arm. 'Come this way,' he said. 'I'll have a word with you in private.'" Chapter
10 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Gesine. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 10. The Other Witness. It was with a thumping heart and nerves all a-tingle that I followed Abel Crone out of his front shop into a sort of office that he had at the back of it, a little dirty hole of a place, in which there was a ramshackle table, a chair or two, a stand-up desk, a cupboard, and the variety of odds and ends that he had picked up on his trade. The man's sudden revelation of knowledge had knocked all the confidence out of me. It had never crossed my mind that any living soul had a notion of my secret, for secret, of course, it was, and one that I would not have trusted to Crone, of all men in the world, knowing him as I did to be such a one for gossip. And he had let this challenge out on me so sharply, catching me unawares that I was alone with him, and, as it were, at his mercy, before I could pull my wits together. Everything in me was confused. I was thinking several things all at a time. How could he come to know? Had I been watched? Had some person followed me out of Berwick that night? Was this part of the general mystery? And what was going to come of it, now that Abel Crone was aware that I knew something which, up to then, I had kept back? I stood helplessly staring at him as he turned up the wick of an old lamp that stood on the mantelpiece littered with a mess of small things, and he caught a sight of my face when there was more light, and as he shut the door on us he laughed as if he knew that he had me in a trap. And before he spoke again, he went over to the cupboard and took out a bottle and glasses. "Will you taste?" he asked, leering at me. "A wee drop now? It'll do you good." "No," said I. "Then I'll drink for the two of us," he responded, and poured out a half-tumblerful of whisky, to which he added precious little water. "Here's to you, my lad, and may you have grace to take advantage of your chances." He winked over the rim of his glass as he took a big pull at its contents, and there was something so villainous in the look of him that it did me good in the way of steeling my nerves again. For I now saw that here was an uncommonly bad man to deal with, and that I had best be on my guard. "Mr. Crone," said I, gazing straight at him, "what's this you have to say to me?" "Sit you down," he answered, pointing at a chair that was shoved under one side of the little table. "Pull that out and sit you down. What we shall have to say to each other will not be said in 5 minutes. Let's confer in the proper and comfortable fashion." I did what he asked, and he took another chair himself, and sat down opposite me, propping his elbow on the table and leaning across it, so that, the table being but narrow, his sharp eyes and questioning lips were closer to mine than I cared for. And while he leaned forward in his chair, I sat back in mine, keeping as far from him as I could, and just staring at him, perhaps as if I had been some trapped animal that couldn't get itself away from the eyes of another that meant presently to kill it. Once again I asked him what he wanted. "You didn't answer my question," he said. "I'll put it again, and you needn't be afraid that anybody'll overhear us in this place. It's safe. I say once more, what for you did not tell in your evidence in that inquest, that you saw Sir Gilbert Carstairs at the crossroads on that night of the murder, hm?" "That's my business," said I. "Just so," said he. "And I'll agree with you in that. It is your business. But if by that you mean it's yours alone, and nobody else's, then I don't agree. Neither would the police." We stared at each other across the table for a minute of silence, and then I put the question directly to him that I had been wanting to put ever since he had first spoken, and I put it crudely enough. "How did you know?" I asked. He laughed at that, sneeringly, of course. "Aye, that's plain enough," said he. "No fencing about that. How did I know? Because when you saw Sir Gilbert, I wasn't 5 feet away from you, and what you saw, I saw. I saw you both." "You were there?" I exclaimed. "Snug behind the hedge in front of which you planted yourself," he answered. "And if you want to know what I was doing there, I'll tell you. I was doing, or had been doing, a bit of poaching. And as I say, what you saw, I saw." "Then I'll ask you a question, Mr. Crone," I said. "Why haven't you told yourself?" "Aye," he said. "You may well ask me that. But I wasn't called as a witness at yon inquest." "You could have come forward," I suggested. "I didn't choose," he retorted. We both looked at each other again, and while we looked, he swigged off his drink and helped himself just as generously to more. And as I was getting bolder by that time, I set to work at questioning him. "You'll be attaching some importance to what you saw?" said I. "Well," he replied slowly, "it's not a pleasant thing, for a man's safety, to be as near as what he was to a place where another man's just been done to his death." "You and I were near enough anyway," I remarked. "We know what we were there for," he flung back at me. "We don't know what he was there for." "Put your tongue on it, Mr. Crone," I said boldly. "The fact is, you suspicion him?" "I suspicion a good deal, maybe," he admitted. "After all, a man of that degree is only a man, when all's said and done, and there might be reasons that you and me knows nothing about. Let me ask you a question," he went on, edging nearer at me across the table. "Have you mentioned it to a soul?" I made a mistake at that, but he was on me so sharp, and his manner was so insistent, that I had the word out of my lips before I thought. "No," I replied, "I haven't." "Nor me," he said. "Nor me. So, you and me are the only two folk that know." "Well?" I asked. He took another pull at his liquor, and for a moment or two sat silent, tapping his fingernails against the rim of the glass. "It's a queer business, Moneylaws," he said at last. "Look at it any way you like, it's a queer business. Here's one man, yon lodger of your mother's, comes into the town and goes around the neighbourhood, reading the old parish registers and asking questions at the parson's. Aye, and he was at it both sides of the Tweed. I've found that much out for myself. For what purpose? Is there money at the back of it, property, something of that sort, dependent on this Gilverthwaite unearthing some facts or other out of those old books? And then comes another man, a stranger, that's as mysterious in his movements as Gilverthwaite was, and he's to meet Gilverthwaite at a certain lonely spot, and at a very strange hour, and Gilverthwaite can't go, and he gets you to go, and you find the man murdered. And close by, you've seen this other man, who between you and me, though it's no secret, is as much a stranger to the neighbourhood as ever Gilverthwaite was, or Phillips was. I don't follow you on that, I said. No? Said he. Then I'll make it plainer to you. Do you know that until Sir Gilbert Carstairs came here, not so long since, to take up his title and his house and the estate, he'd never set foot in the place, never been near the place this 30 year? Man, and his own father, old Sir Alec, and his own sister, Mrs. Ralston of Craig, had never clapped eyes on him since he went away from Hathercleugh, a youngster of 21. Do you tell me that, Mr. Crone? I exclaimed, much surprised at his words. I didn't know so much. Where had he been, then? God knows, said he, and himself. It was said he was a doctor in London and in foreign parts. Him and his brother, elder brother, you're aware, Mr. Michael, they both quarrelled with the old baronet when they were little more than lads, and out they cleared, going their own ways. And news of Michael's death, and the proofs of it, came home not so long before old Sir Alec died, and as Michael had never married, of course the younger brother succeeded when his father came to his end last winter. And as I say, who knows anything about his past doings when he was away more than 30 years, nor what company he kept, nor what secrets he has? Do you follow me? I am following you, Mr. Crone, I answered. It comes to this. You suspect Sir Gilbert? What I say, he answered, is this. He may have had something to do with the affair. You cannot tell, but you and me knows he was near the place, coming from its direction, at the time the murder would be in the doing. And there's nobody knows but you and me. What are you going to do about it? I asked. He had another period of reflection before he replied, and when he spoke it was to the accompaniment of a warning look. It's an ill-advised thing to talk about rich men, said he. Yon man not only has money of his own, but what you might call considerable quantity. But his wife he brought with him is a woman of vast wealth, they tell me. It would be no very wise action on your part to set rumours going, Moneylaws, until you can substantiate them. What about yourself? I asked. You know as much as I do. Aye, and there's one word that sums it all up, says he, and it's a short one. Wait. There'll be more coming out. Keep your counsel a bit, and when the moment comes, and if the moment comes, why, you know there's me behind you to corroborate. And that's all. He got up then with a nod, as if to show that the interview was over, and I was that glad to get away from him that I walked off without another word. End of chapter 10. Recorded by Gesine in May 2007.
Chapter 11 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ian Skillen. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 11. Signatures to the Will. I was so knocked out of the usual run of things by this conversation with Crone that I went away forgetting the bits of stuff I had bought for Tom Dunlop's rabbit hutches and Tom himself, and for that matter, Maisie as well. And instead of going back to Dunlop's, I turned down the riverside, thinking. It was beyond me at that moment to get a clear understanding of the new situation. I couldn't make out what Crone was at. Clearly, he has strong suspicions that Sir Gilbert Carstairs had something to do with, or some knowledge of, the murder of Phillips. And he knew now that there were two of us to bear out each other's testimony that Sir Gilbert was near the scene of the murder at the time it was committed. Why then should he counsel waiting? Why should not the two of us go to the police and tell what we knew? What was it that Crone advised we should wait for? Was something going on, some inquiry being made in the background of things, of which he knew and wouldn't tell me? And this, I think, was chiefly in my thoughts. Was Crone playing some game of his own and designing to use me as a puppet in it? For there was a general atmosphere of subtlety and slyness about the man that forced itself upon me, young as I was. And the way he kept eyeing me as we talked made me feel that I had to do with one that would be hard to circumvent if it came to a matter of craftiness. And at last, after a lot of thinking, as I walked about in the dusk, it struck me that Crone might be for taking a hand in the game of which I had heard, but had never seen played: blackmail. The more I thought over that idea, the more I felt certain of it. His hints about Sir Gilbert's money and his wealthy wife, his advice to wait till we knew more, all seemed to point to this, that evidence might come out which would but require our joint testimony, Crone's and mine, to make it complete. If that were so, then of course Crone or I, or, as he probably designed, the two of us, would be in a position to go to Sir Gilbert Carstairs and tell him what we knew, and ask him how much he would give us to hold our tongues. I saw all the theory of it at last clear enough, and it was just what I would have expected of Abel Crone, knowing him even little as I did. Wait until we were sure, and then strike. That was his game, and I was not going to have anything to do with it. I went home to my bed resolved on that. I'd heard of blackmailing, and I had a good notion of its wickedness and of its danger, and I was not taking shares with Crone in any venture of that sort. But there Crone was, an actual concrete fact that I'd got to deal with and come to some terms with, simply because he knew that I was in possession of knowledge which, to be sure, I ought to have communicated to the police at once, and I was awake much during the night, thinking matters over, and by the time I rose in the morning, I had come to a decision. I would see Crone at once, and give him a sort of ultimatum. Let him come there and then with me to Mr. Murray, and let the two of us tell what we knew and be done with it. If not, then I myself would go straight to Mr. Lindsey and tell him. I set out for the office earlier than usual that morning, and went round by way of the back street, at the bottom of which Crone's store stood facing the river. I sometimes walked round that way of a morning, and I knew that Crone was, as a rule, at his place very early, amongst his old rubbish, or at his favourite game of gossiping with the fishermen that had their boats drawn up there. But when I reached it, the shop was still shut, and though I waited as long as I could, Crone did not come. I knew where he lived, at the top end of the town, and I thought to meet him as I walked up to Mr. Lindsey's, but I had seen nothing of him by the time I reached our office door, so I laid the matter aside until noon, meaning to get a word with him when I went home to my dinner. And though I could have done so there and then, I determined not to say anything to Mr. Lindsey until I had given Crone the chance of saying it with me, to him or to the police. I expected, of course, that Crone would fly into a rage at my suggestion. If so, then I would tell him straight out that I would just take my own way and take it at once. But before noon there was another development in this affair. In the course of the morning, Mr. Lindsey bade me go with him down to my mother's house, where Mrs. Hanson had been lodged for the night. We would go through Gilverthwaite's effects with her, he said, with a view to doing what we could to put her in possession. It might, probably would be, a lengthy and difficult business. That, he remarked, seeing that there was so much that was dark about her brother's recent movements. And as the woman was obviously poor, we had best be stirring on her behalf. So down we went, and in my mother's front parlour, the same that Gilverthwaite had taken as his sitting room, Mr. Lindsey opened the heavy box for the second time in Mrs. Hanson's presence, and I began to make a list of its contents. At the sight of the money it contained, the woman began to tremble. "Oh, mister," she exclaimed, almost tearfully, "but that's a sight of money to be lying there doing naught. I hope there'll be some way of bringing it to me and mine. We could do with it, I promise you." "We'll do our best, ma'am," said Mr. Lindsey. "As you're next of kin, there oughtn't to be much difficulty, and I'll hurry matters up for you as quickly as possible. What I want this morning is for you to see all there is in this chest. He seems to have had no other belongings than this and his clothes here at Mrs. Moneylaw's, at any rate. And as you see, beyond the money, there's little else in the chest but cigars and box after box of curiosities that he's evidently picked up in his travels. Coins, shells, ornaments, all sorts of queer things, some of them no doubt of value, but no papers, no letters, no documents of any sort." A notion suddenly occurred to me. "Mr. Lindsey," said I, "you've never turned out the contents of any of these smaller boxes the other night. There might be papers in one or other of them." "Good notion, Hugh, my lad," he exclaimed. "True, there might. Here goes, then. We'll look through them systematically." In addition to the half-dozen boxes full of prime Havana cigars, which lay at the top of the chest, there were quite a dozen of similar boxes, emptied of cigars and literally packed full of the curiosities of which Mr. Lindsey had just spoken. He had turned out and carefully replaced the contents of 3 or 4 of these when, at the bottom of one filled with old coins, which he said were Mexican and Peruvian, and probably of great interest to collectors, he came across a paper, folded and endorsed in bold letters, and he let out an exclamation as he took this paper out and pointed us to the endorsement. "Do you see that?" he said. "It's the man's will." The endorsement was plain enough. "My will, James Gilverthwaite," and beneath it was a date, 27th of August, 1904. There was a dead silence amongst the 4 of us. My mother had been with us all the time as Mr. Lindsey unfolded the paper, a thick half-sheet of foolscap, and read what was written on it. "This is the last will and testament of me, James Gilverthwaite, a British subject, born at Liverpool, and formerly of Garston in Lancashire, England, now residing temporarily at Colon in the Republic of Panama. I devise and bequeath all my estate and effects, real and personal, which I may be possessed of or entitled to, unto my sister, Sarah Ellen Hanson, the wife of Matthew Hanson, of 37 Preston Street, Garston, Lancashire, England, absolutely, and failing her to any children she may have had by her marriage with Matthew Hanson, in equal shares. And I appoint the said Sarah Ellen Hanson, or in the case of her death, her eldest child, the executor of this my will, and I revoke all former wills. Dated this 27th day of August, 1904. James Gilverthwaite. Signed by the testator in the presence of us." Mr. Lindsey suddenly broke off, and I, looking at him, saw his eyes screw themselves up with sheer wonder at something he saw. Without another word he folded up the paper, put it in his pocket, and turning to Mrs. Hanson, clapped her on the shoulders. "That's all right, ma'am," he said heartily. "That's a good will. duly signed and attested. There'll be no difficulty about getting it admitted to probate. Leave it to me and I'll see to it, and get it through for you as soon as ever I can. And we must do what's possible to find out if this brother of yours has left any other property. Meanwhile, we'll just lock everything up again that we've taken out of the chest." It was close on my dinner hour when we'd finished, but Mr. Lindsey, at his going, motioned me out into the street with him. In a quiet corner, he turned to me and pulled the will from his pocket. "Hugh," he said, "do you know who's one of the witnesses to this will?" "Aye, who are the two witnesses?" "Man, you could have knocked me down with a feather when I saw the names. Look for yourself." He handed me the paper and pointed to the attestation clause with which it ended, and I saw the two names at once: John Phillips, Michael Carstairs, and I let out a cry of astonishment. "Aye, you may well exclaim," said he, taking the will back. "John Phillips, that's the man was murdered the other night. Michael Carstairs, that's the elder brother of Sir Gilbert yonder at Hathercleugh, the man that would have succeeded to the title and estates if he hadn't predeceased old Sir Alexander. What would he be doing now, a friend of Gilverthwaite's?" "I've heard this Michael Carstairs went abroad as a young man, Mr. Lindsey, and never come home again," I remarked. "Likely foregathered with Gilverthwaite out yonder." "Oh, just that," he agreed. "That would be the way of it, no doubt, to be sure. He's set down in this attestation clause as Michael Carstairs, engineer, American quarter, Colon, and John Phillips is described as subcontractor of the same address. The three of 'em will have been working in connection with the Panama Canal. But God bless us, there's some queer facts coming out, my lad. Michael Carstairs knows Gilverthwaite, and Phillips in yon corner of the world, Phillips and Gilverthwaite, when Michael Carstairs is dead, come home to the corner of the world that Michael Carstairs sprang from, and Phillips is murdered as soon as he gets here, and Gilverthwaite dies that suddenly that he can't tell us a word of what it's all about. What is it all about, and who's going to piece it all together? Man, there's more than murder at the bottom of all this. It's a wonder that I didn't let out everything that I knew at that minute, and it may have been the tip of my tongue, but just then he gave me a push towards our door. "I heard your mother say your dinner was waiting you," he said. "Go in now, we'll talk more this afternoon." He strode off up the street, and I turned back and made haste with my dinner. I wanted to drop in at Crone's before I went again to the office. What had just happened had made me resolved that Crone and I should speak out, and if he wouldn't, then I would. And presently I was hurrying away to his place, and as I turned into the back lane that led to it, I ran up against Sergeant Chisholm. "Here's another fine to-do, Mr. Moneylaws," he said. "You'll know yon Abel Crone, the marine store dealer. Aye, well, he's been found drowned, not an hour ago, and by this and that, there's queer marks that looks like violence on him." End of chapter 11. Recording by Ian Skillen.
Of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dead Men's Money by J. S. Fletcher. Chapter 12. The Salmon Gaff. I gave such a jump on hearing this that Chisholm himself started, and he stared at me with a question in his eyes. But I was quick enough to let him know that he was giving me news that I hadn't heard until he opened his lips. "You don't tell me that!" I exclaimed. "What, more of it?" "Aye," he said. "You'll be thinking that this is all of a piece with the other affair. And to be sure, they found Crone's body close by where you found yon other man, Phillips." "Where, then?" I asked. "And when?" "I tell you, not an hour ago," he replied. "The news just came in. I was going down here to see if any of the neighbours at the shop saw Crone in any strange company last night." I hesitated for a second or two and then spoke out. "I saw him myself last night," said I. "I went to his shop, maybe it was 9 o'clock, to buy some bits of stuff to make Tom Dunlop a door to his rabbit hutch, and I was there talking to him 10 minutes or so. He was all right then, and I saw nobody else with him." "Aye, well, he never went home to his house last night," observed Chisholm. "I called in there on my way down. He lived, you know, in a cottage by the police station, and I dropped in and asked the woman that keeps house for him had she seen him this morning, and she said he never came home last night at all, and no wonder, as things are." "But you were saying where it happened," I said. "Where he was found," said he. "Well, and it was where Till runs into Tweed, leastways, a bit up the Till. Do you know John McIlwraith, lad, yon youngster that they've had such a bother with about the school, always running away to his play and stopping out at nights, and the like? There was the question of sending him to a reformatory, you'll remember. Aye, well, it turns out the young waster was out last night in those woods below Twizel, and early this morning, though he didn't let on at it till some time after, he saw the body of a man lying in one of them deep pools in Till. And when he himself was caught by Turndale, who was on the look out for him, he told of what he'd seen, and Turndale and some other men went there, and they found Crone." "You were saying there were marks of violence?" said I. "I haven't seen them myself," he answered, "but by Turndale's account it was him brought in the news. There is queer marks on the body, like as if, as near as Turndale could describe it, as if the man had been struck down before he was drowned. Bruises, you understand." "Where is he?" I asked. "He's where they took Phillips," replied Chisholm. "Dod, that's two of 'em that's been taken there within, aye, nearly within the week." "What are you going to do now?" I inquired. "I was just going, as I said, to ask a question or two down here. Did anybody hear Crone say anything last night about going out that way?" he answered. "But there, I don't see the good of it. Between you and me, Crone was a bit of a night bird. I suspected him of poaching, time and again. Well, he'll do no more of that. You'll be on your way to the office, likely?" "Straight there," said I. "I'll tell Mr. Lindsey of this." But when I reached the office, Mr. Lindsey, who had been out to get his lunch, knew all about it. He was standing outside the door, talking to Mr. Murray, and as I went up the superintendent turned away to the police station, and Mr. Lindsey took a step or two towards me. "Have you heard this about that man Crone?" he asked. "I've just heard it now," I answered. "Chisholm told me." He looked at me and I at him. There were questions in the eyes of both of us. But between parting from the police sergeant and meeting Mr. Lindsey, I had made up my mind, by a bit of sharp thinking and reflection, on what my own plan of action was going to be about all this, once and for all, and I spoke before he could ask anything. "Chisholm," said I, "was down that way, wondering could he hear word of Crone's being seen with anybody last night. I saw Crone last night. I went to his shop, buying some bits of old stuff. He was all right then. I saw nothing. Chisholm, he says Crone was a poacher. That would account, likely, for his being out there." "Aye," said Mr. Lindsey, "but they say there's marks of violence on the body. And the long and short of it is, my lad," he went on, first interrupting himself and then giving me an odd look, "the long and short of it is, it's a queer thing that Crone should have come by his death close to the spot where you found yon man Phillips. There may be nothing but coincidence in it, but there's no denying it's a queer thing. Go and order a conveyance, and we'll drive out yonder." In pursuance of the determination I had come to, I said no more about Crone to Mr. Lindsey. I had made up my mind on a certain course, and until it was taken I could not let out a word of what was by that time nobody's secret but mine, to him, nor to any one, not even to Maisie Dunlop, to whom, purposely, I had not as yet said anything about my seeing Sir Gilbert Carstairs on the night of Phillip's murder. And all the way out to the inn there was silence between Mr. Lindsey and me, and the event of the morning about Gilverthwaite's will, and the odd circumstance of its attestation by Michael Carstairs, was not once mentioned. We kept silence, indeed, until we were in the place to which they had carried Crone's dead body. Mr. Murray and Sergeant Chisholm had got there before us, and with them was a doctor, the same that had been fetched to Philip's, and they were all talking together quietly when we went in. The superintendent came up to Mr. Lindsey. "According to what the doctor here says," he whispered, jerking his head at the body, which lay on the table with a sheet thrown over it, "there's a question as to whether the man met his death by drowning. Look here." He led us up to the table, drew back the sheet from the head and face, and motioning the doctor to come up, pointed to a mark that was just between the left temple and the top of the ear, where the hair was wearing thin. "D'ye see that now?" he murmured. "You'll notice there's some sort of a weapon penetrated there. Penetrated! But the doctor can say more than I can on that point." "The man was struck, felled by some sort of a weapon," said the doctor. "It's penetrated, I should say from mere superficial examination, to the brain. You'll observe there's a bruise outwardly. Aye, but this has been a sharp weapon as well, something with a point, and there's the puncture. How far it may extend I can't tell yet. But on the surface of things, Mr. Lindsey, I should incline to the opinion that the poor fellow was dead or dying when he was thrown into yon pool. Anyway, after a blow like that, he'd be unconscious. But I'm thinking he was dead before the water closed on him." Mr. Lindsey looked closer at the mark, and at the hole in the centre of it. "Has it struck any of you how that could be caused?" he asked suddenly. "It hasn't? Then I'll suggest something to you. There's an implement in pretty constant use hereabouts that would do just that a salmon gaff." The two police officials started. The doctor nodded his head. "Aye, that's a sensible remark," said he. "A salmon gaff would just do it." He turned to Chisholm with a sharp look. "You were saying this man was suspected of poaching?" he asked. "Likely it'll have been some poaching affair he was after last night, him and others, and they may have quarrelled and come to blows, and there you are." "Were there any signs of a fray close by or near, on the bank?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "We're going down there now, ourselves, to have a look round," answered Mr. Murray. "But according to Turndale, the body was lying in a deep pool in the Till, under the trees on the bank. It might have lain there for many a month if it hadn't been for yon young McIlwraith, that has a turn for prying into dark and out of the way corners. Well, here's more matter for the coroner." Mr. Lindsey and I went back to Berwick after that, and once more he said little on the journey, except that it would be well if it came out that this was but a poaching affair in which Crone had got across with some companion of his. And for the rest of the afternoon he made no further remark to me about the matter, nor about the discovery of the morning. But as I was leaving the office at night, he gave me a word. "Say nothing about that will to anybody," said he. "I'll think that matter over tonight, and see what'll come of my thinking. It's as I said before, Hugh, to get at the bottom of all this, we'll have to go back, maybe a far way." I said nothing and went home, for now I had work of my own. I was going to what I had resolved on after Chisholm told me the news about Crone. I would not tell my secret to Mr. Lindsey, nor to the police, nor even to Maisie. I would go straight and tell it to the one man whom it concerned, Sir Gilbert Carstairs. I would speak plainly to him, and be done with it. And as soon as I had eaten my supper, I mounted my bicycle, and, as the dusk was coming on, rode off to Hathercleugh House. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13. Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Dead Men's Money by J. S. Fletcher. Chapter 13. Sir Gilbert Carstairs. It was probably with a notion of justifying my present course of procedure to myself that during that ride I went over the reasons which had kept my tongue quiet up to that time, and now led me to go to Sir Gilbert Carstairs. Why I had not told the police nor Mr. Lindsey of what I had seen, I have already explained. My own natural caution and reserve made me afraid of saying anything that might cast suspicion on an innocent man, and also I wanted to await developments. I was not concerned much with that feature of the matter, but I had undergone some qualms because I had not told Maisie Dunlop, for ever since the time at which she and I had come to a serious and sober understanding, it had been a settled thing between us that we would never have any secrets from each other. Why, then, had I not told her of this? That took a lot of explaining afterwards, when things so turned out that it would have been the best thing ever I did in my life if I only had confided in her. But this explanation was, after all, to my credit. I did not tell Maisie because I knew that, taking all the circumstances into consideration, she would fill herself with doubts and fears for me, and would for ever be living in an atmosphere of dread lest I, like Phillips, should be found with a knife thrust in me. So much for that. It was in Maisie's own interest. And why, after keeping silence to everybody, did I decide to break it to Sir Gilbert Carstairs? There, Andrew Dunlop came in, of course, unawares to himself. For in those lecturings that he was so fond of giving us young folk, there was a moral precept of his kept cropping up which he seemed to set great store by. If you've anything against a man, or reason to mistrust him, he would say, don't keep it to yourself, or hint it to other people behind his back, but go straight to him and tell him to his face, and have it out with him. He was a wise man, Andrew Dunlop, as all his acquaintance knew, and I felt that I could do no better than take a lesson from him in this matter. So I would go straight to Sir Gilbert Carstairs, and tell him what was on my mind, let the consequences be what they might. It was well after sunset, and the gloaming was over the hills and the river, when I turned into the grounds of Hathercleugh, and looked round me at a place which, though I had lived close to it ever since I was born, I had never set foot in before. The house stood on a plateau of ground high above Tweed, with a deep shawl of wood behind it and a fringe of plantations on either side. House and pleasure grounds were enclosed by a high ivied wall on all sides. You could see little of either until you were within the gates. It looked, in that evening light, a romantic and picturesque old spot, and one in which you might well expect to see ghosts, or fairies, or the like. The house itself was something between an 18th century mansion and an old border fortress. Its centre part was very high in the roof, and had turrets, with outer stairs to them at the corners. The parapets were embattled, and in the turrets were arrow slits. But romantic as the place was, there was nothing gloomy about it, and as I passed to the front, between the grey walls and a sunk balustered garden that lay at the foot of a terrace, I heard through the open windows of one brilliantly lighted room the click of billiard balls and the sound of men's light-hearted laughter, and through another the notes of a piano. There was a grand butler man met at the hall door, and looked sourly at me as I leaned my bicycle against one of the pillars and made up to him. He was sourer still when I asked to see his master, and he shook his head at me, looking me up and down as if I were some undesirable. "You can't see Sir Gilbert at this time of the evening," said he. "What do you want?" "Will you tell Sir Gilbert that Mr. Moneylaws, clerk to Mr. Lindsey, solicitor, wishes to see him on important business?" I answered, looking him hard in the face. "I think he'll be quick to see me when you give him that message." He stared and growled at me a second or two before he went off with an ill grace, leaving me on the steps. But, as I had expected, he was back almost at once, and beckoning me to enter and follow him. And follow him I did, past more flunkeys who stared at me as if I had come to steal the silver, and through soft-carpeted passages to a room in which he led me with small politeness. "You're to sit down and wait," he said gruffly. "Sir Gilbert will attend to you presently." He closed the door on me, and I sat down and looked around. I was in a small room that was filled with books from floor to ceiling, big books and little, in fine leather bindings, and the gilt of their letterings and labels shining in the rays of a tall lamp that stood on a big desk in the centre. It was a fine room that, with everything luxurious in the way of furnishings and appointments. You could have sunk your feet in the warmth of the carpets and rugs, and there were things in it for comfort and convenience that I had never heard tell of. I had never been in a rich man's house before, and the grandeur of it, the idea that it gave one of wealth, made me feel that there's a vast gulf fixed between them that have and them that have not. And in the middle of these philosophies the door suddenly opened, and in walked Sir Gilbert Carstairs, and I stood up and made my politest bow to him. He nodded affably enough, and he laughed as he nodded. "Oh," said he, "Mr. Moneylaws, I've seen you before, at that inquest the other day, I think, didn't I?" "That is so, Sir Gilbert," I answered. "I was there with Mr. Lindsey." "Why, of course, and you gave evidence," he said. "I remember. Well, and what did you want to see me about, Mr. Moneylaws?" "Will you smoke a cigar?" he went on, picking up a box from the table and holding it out to me. "Help yourself." "Thank you, Sir Gilbert," I answered, "but I haven't started that yet." "Well, then, I will," he laughed, and he picked out a cigar, lighted it, and flinging himself into an easy chair, motioned me to take another exactly opposite to him. "Now then, fire away," he said. "Nobody'll interrupt us, and my time's yours. You've some message for me?" I took a good look at him before I spoke. He was a big, fine, handsome man, some 55 years of age, I should have said, but uncommonly well preserved, a clean-shaven, powerful-faced man, with quick eyes and a very alert glance. Maybe, if there was anything struck me particularly about him, it was the rapidity and watchfulness of his glances, the determination in his square jaw, and the extraordinary strength and whiteness of his teeth. He was quick at smiling, and quick, too, in use of his hands, which were always moving as he spoke, as if to emphasize whatever he said. And he made a very fine and elegant figure as he sat there in his grand evening clothes, and I was puzzled to know which struck me most, the fact that he was what he was, the 7th baronet and head of an old family, or the familiar, easy, good-natured fashion which he treated me, and talked to me, as if I had been a man of his own rank. I had determined what to do as I sat waiting him, and now that he had bidden me to speak, I told him the whole story from start to finish, beginning with Gilverthwaite and ending with Crone, and sparing no detail or explanation of my own conduct. He listened in silence, and with more intentness and watchfulness than I had ever seen a man show in my life, and now and then he nodded and sometimes smiled, and when I had made an end he put a sharp question. "So, beyond Crone, who, I hear, is dead, you've never told a living soul of this?" he asked, eyeing me closely. "No one, Sir Gilbert," I assured him. "Not even—" "Not even who?" he inquired quickly. "Not even my own sweetheart," I said, "and it's the first secret ever I kept from her." He smiled at that, and gave me a quick look as if he were trying to get a fuller idea of me. "Well," he said, "and you did right. Not that I should care two pins, Mr. Moneylaws, if you'd told all this out at the inquest, but suspicion is easily aroused, and it spreads, like wildfire, and I'm a stranger, as if it were, in this country so far, and these people might think things that I wouldn't have them think, and, in short, I'm much obliged to you, and I'll tell you frankly, as you've been frank with me, how I came to be at those crossroads at that particular time and on that particular night. It's a simple explanation, and could be easily corroborated, if need be. I suffer from a disturbing form of insomnia, sleeplessness. It's a custom of mine to go long walks late at night. Since I came here, I've been out that way almost every night, as my servants could assure you. I walk, as a rule, from 9 o'clock to 12, to induce sleep, and on that night I'd been miles and miles out towards Yetholm and back, and when you saw me with my map and electric torch, I was looking for the nearest turn home. I'm not too well acquainted with the border yet," he concluded with a flash of his white teeth, "and I have to carry a map with me, and that's how it was, and that's all." I rose out of my chair at that. He spoke so readily and ingenuously that I had no more doubt of the truth of what he was saying than I had of my own existence. "Then it's all for me, too, Sir Gilbert," said I. "I shan't say a word more of the matter to anybody. It's as if it never existed. I was thinking all the time there'd be an explanation of it, so I'll be bidding you good night." "Sit you down again a minute," said he, pointing to the easy chair. "No need for hurry. You're a clerk to Mr. Lindsey, the solicitor?" "I am that," I answered. "Are you articled to him?" he asked. "No," said I. "I am an ordinary clerk of 7 years' standing." "Plenty of experience of office work and routine?" he inquired. "Aye," I replied. "No end of that, Sir Gilbert." "Are you good at figures and accounts?" he asked. "I've kept all Mr. Lindsey's, and a good many trust accounts, for the last 5 years," I answered, wondering what all this was about. "In fact, you're thoroughly well up in all clerical matters?" he suggested. "Keeping books, writing letters, all that sort of thing?" "I can honestly say I'm a past master in everything of that sort," I affirmed. He gave me a quick glance, as if he were sizing me up altogether. "Well, I'll tell you what, Mr. Moneylaws," he said. "The fact is, I'm wanting a sort of steward, and it strikes me that you're just the man I'm looking for." End of chapter 13.
Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Carl. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 14. I was so much amazed by this extraordinary suggestion that for the moment I could only stand staring at him, and before I could find my tongue he threw a quick question at me. "Lindsey wouldn't stand in your way, would he?" he asked. "Such jobs don't go begging, you know." "Mr. Lindsey wouldn't stand in my way, Sir Gilbert," I answered. "But what?" he said, seeing me hesitate. "Is it a post you wouldn't care about, then? There's $500 a year with it, and a permanency." Strange as it may seem, considering all the circumstances, it never occurred to me for one moment that the man was buying my silence, buying me. There wasn't the ghost of such a thought in my head. I let out what was there in my next words. "I'd like such a post fine, Sir Gilbert," I said. "What I'm thinking of could I give satisfaction?" He laughed at that, as if my answer amused him. "Well, there's nothing like a spice of modesty, Moneylaws," he said. "If you can do all we've just talked of, you'll satisfy me well enough. I like the looks of you, and I'm sure you're the sort that'll do the thing thoroughly. The post's at your disposal, if you'd like to take it." I was struggling with my amazement. £500 a year, and a permanency! It seemed a fortune to a lad of my age, and I was trying to find the right words in which to say all that I felt, when he spoke again. "Look here," he said, "don't let us arrange this as if we'd done it behind your present employer's back. I wouldn't like Mr. Lindsey to think I'd gone behind him to get you. Let it be done this way. I'll call on Mr. Lindsey myself and tell him I'm wanting a steward for the property, and that I've heard good reports of his clerk, and that I'll engage you on his recommendation. He's the sort that would give you a strong word by way of reference, eh?" "Oh, he'll do that, Sir Gilbert!" I exclaimed. "Anything that'll help me on." "Then let's leave it at that," he said. "I'll drop in on him at his office, perhaps tomorrow. In the meantime, keep your own counsel. But you'll take my offer?" "I'd be proud and glad to, Sir Gilbert," I said. "And if you'll make allowance for a bit of inexperience, you'll do your best, eh?" he laughed. "That's all right, Moneylaws." He walked out with me to the door and on to the terrace. As I wheeled my bicycle away from the porch, he took a step or two alongside me, his hands in his pockets, his lips humming a careless tune. And suddenly he turned on me. "Have you heard any more about that affair last night?" he asked. "I mean, about Crone." "Nothing, Sir Gilbert," I answered. "I hear that the opinion is the man was struck down by a gaff," he remarked, "and perhaps killed before he was thrown into the till." "So the doctors seem to think," I said. "And the police, too, I believe." "Aye, well," he said, "I don't know if the police are aware of it, but I'm very sure there's night poaching of salmon going on hereabouts, Moneylaws. I've fancied it for some time, and I've thoughts of talking to the police about it. But you see, my land doesn't touch either Till or Tweed, so I haven't cared to interfere. But I'm sure that it's so, and it wouldn't surprise me if both these men, Crone and Phillips, met their deaths at the hands of the gang I'm thinking of. It's a notion that's worth following up, anyway, and I'll have a word with Murray about it when I'm in the town tomorrow." Then, with a brief good night, he left me and went into the house, and I got outside Hathercleugh and rode home in a whirl of thoughts. And I'll confess readily that those thoughts had little to do with what Sir Gilbert Carstairs had last talked about. They were not so much of Phillips, nor of Crone, nor of his suggestion of a possible gang of night poachers, as about myself and the sudden chance of a great change in my fortunes. For, when all is said and done, we must needs look after ourselves, and when a young man of the age I was then arrived at is asked if he would like to exchange a clerkship of 120 a year for a stewardship at more than 4 times as much, as a permanency, you must agree that his mind will fix itself on what such an exchange means to him, to the exclusion of all other affairs. 500 a year to me meant all sorts of fine things: independence, a house of my own, and, not least by a long way, marriage with Maisie Dunlop. And it was a wonder that I managed to keep cool and to hold my tongue when I got home, but hold it I did, and to some purpose, and more than once. During the half hour which I managed to get with Maisie last thing that night, she asked me why I was so silent, and, hard though it was to keep from doing so, I let nothing out. The truth was, Sir Gilbert Carstairs had fascinated me, not only with his grand offer, but with his pleasant, off-hand, companionable manners. He had put me at my ease at once, and had spoken so frankly and with such evident sincerity about his doings on that eventful night that I accepted every word he said. And, in the little that I had thought of it, I was very ready to accept his theory as to how those two men had come by their deaths, and it was one that was certainly feasible and worth following up. Some years before, I remembered, something of the same sort had gone on, and had resulted in an affray between salmon poachers and river watchers. Why should it not have cropped up again? The more I thought of it, the more I felt Sir Gilbert's suggestion to have reason in it. And in that case all the mystery would be knocked clean out of these affairs. The murder of Phillips, the death of Crone, might prove to be the outcome of some vulgar encounter between them and desperadoes who had subsequently scuttled to safety and were, doubtless, quaking near at hand, in fear of their misdeeds coming to light. What appeared to be a perfect tangle might be the simplest matter in the world. So I judged, and next morning there came news that seemed to indicate that matters were going to be explained on the lines which Sir Gilbert had suggested. Chisholm brought that news to our office just after Mr. Lindsey had come in. He told it to both of us, and from his manner of telling it, we both saw, I perhaps not so clearly as Mr. Lindsey, that the police were already at their favourite trick of going for what seemed to them the obvious line of pursuit. "I'm thinking we've got on the right clue at last as regards the murder of yon man Phillips," announced Chisholm with an air of satisfaction. "And if it is the right clue, as it seems to be, Mr. Lindsey, there'll be no great mystery in the matter after all. Just a plain case of murder for the sake of robbery, that's it." "What's your clue?" asked Mr. Lindsey quietly. "Well," answered Chisholm, with a sort of sly wink, "you'll understand, Mr. Lindsey, that we haven't been doing nothing these last few days since yon inquest on Phillips, you know. As a matter of fact, we've been making inquiries wherever there seemed a chance of finding anything out. And we found something out through one of the banks yonder at Peebles." He looked at us to see if we were impressed. Seeing, at any rate, that we were deeply interested, he went on. "It appears, I'll tell you the story in order, as it were," he said. "It appears that about 8 months ago the agent of the British Linen Bank at Peebles got a letter from one John Phillips, written from a place called Colon in Panama, that's Central America, as you'll be aware, enclosing a draft for £3,000 in the International Banking Corporation of New York. The letter instructed the Peebles agent to collect this sum and to place it in his bank to the writer's credit. Furthermore, it stated that the money was to be there until Phillips came home from Scotland in a few months' time from the date of writing. This, of course, was all done in due course, and there was £3,000 in Phillips's name. There was a bit of correspondence between him at Cologne and the bank at Peebles. Then, at last, he wrote that he was leaving Panama for Scotland, and would call on the bank as soon after his arrival. And on the morning of the day on which he was murdered, Phillips did call at the bank and establish his identity, and so on, and he then drew out £500 of his money, £200 in gold, and the rest in small notes. And, Mr. Lindsey, he carried that sum away with him in a little handbag that he had with him." Mr. Lindsey, who had been listening with great attention, nodded. "Aye," he said, "carried £500 away with him. Go on, then." "Now," continued Chisholm, evidently very well satisfied with himself for the way he was marshalling his facts, "we, that is, to put it plainly, I myself, have been making more searching inquiries about Cornhill and Coldstream. There's 2 of the men at Cornhill station will swear that when Phillips got out of the train there that evening of the murder, he was carrying a little handbag such as the bank cashier remembers, a small new brown leather bag. They're certain of it. The ticket collector remembers him putting it under his arm while he searched his pocket for his ticket, and, what's more, the landlord of the inn across the bridge there in Coldstream, he remembers the bag clearly enough, and that Phillips never had his hand off of it while he was in his house. And of course, Mr. Lindsey, the probability is that in that bag was the money, just as he had drawn out at the bank." "You've more to tell," remarked Mr. Lindsey. "Just so," replied Chisholm. "And there's 2 items. First of all, we found that bag empty, you may be sure in the woods near the old ruin on Tillside, thrown away under a lot of stuff, dead stuff, you'll understand, where it might have lain till doomsday if I hadn't had a most particular search made. But that's not all. The second item is here. The railway folk at Cornhill are unanimous in declaring that by the same train which brought Phillips here, 2 men, strangers, that looked like tourist gentlemen came as well, whose tickets were from where do you think, then, Mr. Lindsey?" "Peebles, of course," answered Mr. Lindsey. "And you've guessed right!" exclaimed Chisholm triumphantly. "Peebles it was. And now, how do you think this affair looks? There's so many tourists on Tweedside this time of year that nobody paid any great attention that night to these men, nor where they went. But what could be plainer, do you think? Of course, those 2 had tracked Phillips from the bank, and they followed him till they had him in yon place where he was found, and they murdered him to rob him." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Carl. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 15. 500 a year. It was very evident that Chisholm was in a state of gleeful assurance about his theory, and I don't think he was very well pleased when Mr. Lindsey, instead of enthusiastically acclaiming it as a promising one, began to ask him questions. "You found a pretty considerable sum on Phillips as it was when you searched his body, didn't you?" he asked. "Aye, a good lot," assented Chisholm. "But it was in a pocket book in an inner pocket of his coat, and in his purse." "If it was robbery, why didn't they take everything?" inquired Mr. Lindsey. "Aye, I knew you'd ask that," replied Chisholm. "But the thing is that they were interrupted. The bag they could carry off, but it's probable that they heard Mr. Moneylaws here coming down the lane before they could search the man's pockets." "Umph!" said Mr. Lindsey. "And how do you account for 2 men getting away from the neighbourhood without attracting attention?" "Easy enough," declared Chisholm. "As I said just now, there's numbers of strangers comes about Tweedside at this time of the year, and who'd think anything of seeing them? What was easier than for these 2 to separate, to keep close during the rest of the night, and to get away by train from some wayside station or other the next morning? They could manage it easily, and were making inquiries at all the stations in the district on both sides the Tweed, with that idea." "Well, you'll have a lot of people to follow up, then," remarked Mr. Lindsey dryly. "If you're going to follow every tourist that got on a train next morning between Berwick and Wooler, and Berwick and Kelso, and Berwick and Bournemouth, and Berwick and Blyth, you'll have your work set, I'm thinking." "All the same," said Chisholm doggedly, "that's how it's been. And the bank at Peebles has the numbers of the notes that Phillips carried off in his little bag, and I'll trace those fellows yet, Mr. Lindsey." "Good luck to you, Sergeant," answered Mr. Lindsey. He turned to me when Chisholm had gone. "That's the police all over, Hugh," he remarked. "And you might talk till you were black in the face to yon man, and he'd stick to his story." "You don't believe it, then?" I asked him, somewhat surprised. "He may be right," he replied. "I'm not saying. Let him attend to his business, and now we'll be seeing to ours." It was a busy day with us in the office that, being the day before court day, we had no time to talk of anything but our own affairs. But during the afternoon, at a time when I had left the office for an hour or 2 on business, Sir Gilbert Carstairs called, and he was closeted with Mr. Lindsey when I returned. And after they had been together some time, Mr. Lindsey came out to me and beckoned me into a little waiting room that we had, and shut the door on us. And I saw at once from the expression on his face that he had no idea that Sir Gilbert and I had met the night before, or that I had any notion of what he was going to say to me. "Hugh, my lad," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, "you're evidently one of those that are born lucky. What's the old saying? Some achieve greatness, some have greatness thrust upon them. Eh? Here's greatness, in a degree, thrusting itself on you." "What's this you're talking about, Mr. Lindsey?" I asked. "There's not much greatness about me, I'm thinking." "Well, it's not what you're thinking in this case," he answered. "It's what other folks are thinking of you. Here's Sir Gilbert Carstairs in my room yonder. He's wanting a steward. Somebody that can keep accounts and letters and look after the estate, and he's been looking round for a likely man, and he's heard that Lindsay's clerk, Hugh Moneylaws, is just the sort he wants, and, in short, the job's yours, if you like to take it. And, my lad, it's worth 500 a year, and a permanency too. Fine chance for a young fellow of your age." "Do you advise me to take it, Mr. Lindsey?" I asked, endeavouring to combine surprise with the proper respect for the value of his counsel. "It's a serious job that, for, as you say, a young man." "Not if he's got your headpiece on him," he replied, giving me another clap on the shoulder. "I do advise you to take it. I've given you the strongest recommendations to him. Go into my office now and talk it over with Sir Gilbert by yourself. But when it comes to settling details, call me in. I'll see you're done right to." I thanked him warmly and went into his room, where Sir Gilbert was sitting in an easy chair. He motioned me to shut the door, and, once that was done, he gave a quick, inquiring look. "You didn't let him know that you and I had talked last night?" he asked at once. "No," I said. "That's right, and I didn't either," he went on. "I don't want him to know I spoke to you before speaking to him. It would look as if I were trying to get his clerk away from him. Well, that's settled then. Moneylaws, you'll take the post?" "I shall be very glad to, Sir Gilbert," said I, "and I'll serve you to the best of my ability, if you'll have a bit of patience with me at the beginning. There'll be some difference between my present job and this you're giving me, but I'm a quick learner and—" "Oh, that's all right, man," he interrupted carelessly. "You'll do all that I want. I hate accounts, and letter writing, and all that sort of thing. Take all that off my hands, and you'll do. Of course, whenever you're in a fix about anything, come to me. But I can explain all there is to do in an hour's talk with you in the beginning. All right, ask Mr. Lindsey to step in to me, and we'll put the matter on a business footing." Mr. Lindsey came in and took over the job of settling matters on my behalf, and the affair was quickly arranged. I was to stay with Mr. Lindsey another month, as to give him the opportunity of getting a new head clerk. Then I was to enter on my new duties at Hathercleugh. I was to have £500 a year salary, with 6 months' notice on either side. At the end of 5 years, if I was still in the situation, the terms were to be revised with a view to an increase, and all this was to be duly set down in black and white. These propositions, of course, were Mr. Lindsey's, and Sir Gilbert assented to all of them readily and promptly. He appeared to be the sort of man who was inclined to accept anything put before him rather than have a lot of talk about it. And presently, remarking that that was all right, and he'd leave Mr. Lindsey to see to it, he rose to go, but at the door he paused and came back. "I'm thinking of dropping in at the police station and telling Murray my ideas about that Crone affair," he remarked. "It's my opinion, Mr. Lindsey, that there's salmon poaching going on hereabouts, and if my land adjoined either Tweed or Till, I'd have spoken about it before. There are queer characters about along both rivers at nights. I know, because I go out a good deal, very late, walking, to try and cure myself of insomnia, and I know what I've seen. It's my impression that Crone was probably mixed up with some gang, and that his death arose out of an affray between them." "That's probable," answered Mr. Lindsey. "There was trouble of that sort some years ago, but I haven't heard of it lately. Certainly it would be a good thing to start the idea in Murray's head. He might follow it up and find something out. That other business, the Phillips murder, might have sprung out of some cause," suggested Sir Gilbert, "if those chaps caught a stranger in a lonely place." "The police have a theory already about Phillips," remarked Mr. Lindsey. "They think he was followed from Peebles and murdered for the sake of money that he was carrying in a bag he had with him. And my experience," he added with a laugh, "is that if the police once get a theory of their own, it's no use suggesting any other to them. They'll ride theirs, either till it drops or they get home with it." Sir Gilbert nodded, as if he agreed with that, and he suddenly gave Mr. Lindsey an inquiring look. "What's your own opinion?" he asked. But Mr. Lindsey was not to be drawn. He laughed and shrugged his shoulders, as if to indicate that the affair was none of his. "I wouldn't say that I have an opinion, Sir Gilbert," he answered. "It's much too soon to form one, and I haven't the details, and I'm not a detective. But all these matters are very simple when you get to the bottom of them. The police think this is going to be a very simple affair, mere vulgar murder for the sake of mere vulgar robbery. We shall see." Then Sir Gilbert went away, and Mr. Lindsey looked at me, who stood a little apart, and he saw that I was thinking. "Well, my lad," he said, a bit dazed by your new opening, "it's a fine chance for you, too. Now, I suppose, you'll be wanting to get married. Is it that you're thinking about?" "Well, I was not, Mr. Lindsey," said I. "I was just wondering, if you must know, how it was that, as he was here, you didn't tell Sir Gilbert about that signature of his brother's that you found on the Gilverthwaite's will." He shared a sharp look between me and the door, but the door was safely shut. "No," he said, "neither to him nor anybody yet awhile. And don't you mention that, my lad. Keep it dark till I give the word. I'll find out about that in my own way. You understand on that point, absolute silence." I replied that, of course, I would not say a word, and presently I went into the office to resume my duties. But I had not been long at that before the door opened, and Chisholm put his face within and looked at me. "I'm wanting you, Mr. Moneylaws," he said. "You said you were with Crone, buying something, the night before his body was found. You'd be paying him money, and he might be giving you change. Do you happen to see his purse now?" "I answered. "What for do you ask that?" "Because," he said, "we've taken a fellow at one of those riverside publics that's been drinking heavily, and, of course, spending money freely, and he has a queer-looking purse on him, and one or two men that's seen it vows and declares it was Abel Crone's." End of chapter 15. Dead Men's Money.
Of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 16. The Man in the Cell. Before I could reply to Chisholm's inquiry, Mr. Lindsey put his head out of his door, and seeing the police sergeant there, asked me what he was after. And when Chisholm had repeated his inquiry, both looked at me. "I did see Crone's purse that night," I answered. "An old thing that he kept tied up with a bootlace. And he'd a lot of money in it, too." "Come round, then, and see if you can identify this that we found on the man," requested Chisholm. "And," he added, turning to Mr. Lindsey, "there's another thing. The man's sober enough, now that we've got him. It's given him a bit of a pull together, being arrested, and he's demanding a lawyer. Perhaps you'll come to him, Mr. Lindsey." "Who is he?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "A Berwick man?" "He isn't," replied Chisholm. "He's a stranger. A fellow that says he was seeking work, and had been stopping at a common lodging-house in the town. He vows and declares that he'd nothing to do with killing Crone, and he's shouting for a lawyer." Mr. Lindsey put on his hat, and he and I went off with Chisholm to the police station. And as we got in sight of it, we became aware that there was a fine to do in the street before its door. The news of the arrest had spread quickly, and folk had come running to get more particulars. And amongst the women and children and loafers that were crowding around was Crone's housekeeper, a great, heavy, rough-haired Irishwoman named Nance Maguire, and she was waving her big arms and shaking her fists at a couple of policemen, whom she was adjuring to bring out the murderer so that she might do justice on him then and there. All this being mingled with encomiums on the victim. "The best man that ever lived!" she was screaming at the top of her voice. "The best and kindest creature ever set foot in your murdering town. And didn't I know he was to be done to death by some of ye? And didn't he tell me himself that there was one would give his 2 eyes to be seeing his corpse? And if you've laid hands on him that did it, bring him out to me so, and I'll—" Mr. Lindsey laid a quiet hand on the woman's arm, and twisted her round in the direction of her cottage. "Hold your wisht, good wife, and go home," he whispered to her. "And if you know anything, keep your tongue still till I come to see you. Be away now, and leave it to me." I don't know how it was, but Nance Maguire, after a sharp look at Mr. Lindsey, turned away as meekly as a lamb, and went off, tearful enough, but quiet, down the street, followed by half the rabble, while Mr. Lindsey, Chisholm, and myself turned into the police station. And there we met Mr. Murray, who wagged his head at us as if he were very well satisfied with something. "Not much doubt about this last affair, anyhow," said he, as he took us into his office. "You might say the man was caught red-handed. All the same, Mr. Lindsey, he's in his rights to ask for a lawyer, and you can see him whenever you like." "What are the facts?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "Let me know that much first." Mr. Murray jerked his thumb at Chisholm. "The sergeant there knows him," he answered. "He took the man." "It was this way, d'ye see, Mr. Lindsey," said Chisholm, who was becoming an adept at putting statements before people. "You know that bit of public there is along the river yonder, outside the wall, the cod and lobster? Well, James McFarlane, that keeps it, he came to me, maybe an hour or so ago, and said there was a fellow, a stranger, had been in and out there all day since morning, drinking, and though he wouldn't say the man was what you'd rightly call drunk, still he'd had a skinful, and he was in there again, and they wouldn't serve him, and he was getting quarrelsome and abusive, and in the middle of it had pulled out a purse that another man who was in there vowed and declared, aside, to McFarlane, was Abel Crone's. So I got a couple of constables and went back with McFarlane, and there was the man vowing he'd be served, and with a handful of money to prove that he could pay for whatever he called for. And as he began to turn ugly and show fight, we just clapped the bracelets on him and brought him along, and there he is in the cells, and, of course, it's sobered him down, and he's demanding his rights to see a lawyer." "Who is he?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "A stranger to the town," replied Chisholm, "and he'll neither give name nor address, but to a lawyer, he declares. But we know he was staying at one of the common lodging houses, Watson's, 3 nights ago, and that the last 2 nights he wasn't in there at all." "Well, where's that purse?" demanded Mr. Lindsey. "Mr. Moneylaws here says he can identify it if it's Crone's." Chisholm opened a drawer and took out what I at once knew to be Abel Crone's purse, which was in reality a sort of old pocket book or wallet, or some sort of skin, with a good deal of the original hair left on it, and tied about with a bit of old bootlace. There were both gold and silver in it, just as I had seen when Crone pulled it out to find me some change for a 5-shilling piece I had given him, and more by token, there was the 5-shilling piece itself. "That's Crone's purse!" I exclaimed. "I've no doubt about it. And that's a crown piece I gave him myself. I've no doubt about that either." "Let us see the man," said Mr. Lindsey. Chisholm led us down a corridor to the cells and unlocked a door. He stepped within the cell behind it, motioning us to follow. And there, on the one stool which the place contained, sat a big, hulking fellow that looked like a navvy, whose rough clothes bore evidence of his having slept out in them, and whose boots were stained with the mud and clay which they would be likely to collect along the riverside. He was sitting nursing his head in his hands, growling to himself, and he looked up at us as I have seen wild beasts look out through the bars of cages. And somehow there was that in the man's eyes which made me think, there and then, that he was not reflecting on any murder that he had done, but was sullenly and stupidly angry with himself. "Now then, here's a lawyer for you," said Chisholm. "Mr. Lindsey, solicitor." "Well, my man," began Mr. Lindsey, taking a careful look at this queer client, "what have you got to say to me?" The prisoner gave Chisholm a disapproving look. "Not going to say a word before the likes of him," he growled. "I know my rights, governor. What I say, I'll say private to you." "Better leave us, sergeant," said Mr. Lindsey. He waited till Chisholm, a bit unwillingly, had left the cell and closed the door, and then he turned to the man. "Now then," he continued, "you know what they charge you with? You've been drinking hard. Are you sober enough to talk sense? Very well, then. What's this you want me for?" "To defend me, of course," growled the prisoner. He twisted a hand round to the back of his trousers as if to find something. "I've money of my own, a bit put away in a belt," he said. "I'll pay you." "Never mind that now," answered Mr. Lindsey. "Who are you? And what do you want to say?" "Name of John Carter," replied the man. "General labourer, navvy work. Anything of that sort. On tramp, seeking a job. Came here going north night before last, and no more to do with the murder of yon man than you have." "They found his purse on you, anyway," remarked Mr. Lindsey bluntly. "What have you got to say to that?" "What I say is that I'm a damned fool," answered Carter surlily. "It's all against me, I know, but I'll tell you, you can tell lawyers anything. Who's that young fellow?" he demanded suddenly, glaring at me. "I'm not going to talk before no detectives." "My clerk," replied Mr. Lindsey. "Now then, tell your tale, and just remember what a dangerous position you're in." "Know that as well as you do," muttered the prisoner. "But I'm sober enough now. It's this way. I stopped here in the town 3 nights since, and looked about for a job next day. Then I heard of something likely up the river, and went after it, and didn't get it, so I started back here, late at night, it was. And after crossing that bridge at a place called Twizel, I turned down to the river bank, thinking to take a short cut, and it was well after dark then, mind you, governor. In coming along through the woods, just before where the little river runs into the big one, I come across this man's body. Stumbled on it. That's the truth." "Well," said Mr. Lindsey. "He was lying, I could show you the place easy, between the edge of the wood and the river bank," continued Carter. "And though he was dead enough when I found him, governor, he hadn't been dead long. But dead he was, and not from aught of my doing." "What time was this?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "It would be past 11 o'clock," replied Carter. "It was 10 when I called by Cornhill station. I went the way I did, down through the woods to the river bank, because I noticed a hut there in the morning that I could sleep in. I was making for that when I found the body." "Well, about the purse?" demanded Mr. Lindsey shortly. "No lies, now." The prisoner shook his head at that, and growled, but it was evident he was growling at himself. "That's right enough," he confessed. "I felt in his pockets, and I did take the purse, but I didn't put him in the water. True as I'm here, governor, I did no more than take the purse. I left him there, just as he was, and the next day I got drinking, and last night I stopped in that hut again, and today I was drinking pretty heavy, and I sort of lost my head and pulled the purse out, and that's the truth, anyway, whether you believe it or not. But I didn't kill yon man, though I'll admit I robbed his body, like the fool I am." "Well, you'll see where it's landed you," remarked Mr. Lindsey. "All right, hold your tongue now, and I'll see what I can do. I'll appear for you when you come before the magistrate tomorrow." He tapped at the door of the cell, and Chisholm, who had evidently waited in the corridor, let us out. Mr. Lindsey said nothing to him nor to the superintendent. He led me away into the street, and there he clapped me on the arm. "I believe every word that man said," he murmured. "Come on now, we'll see this Nance Maguire." Chapter 17